that one glorious word represents more than just the geography between the Sabine and the Rio Grande. It represents a unique idea and way of life. A life of rugged individualism, proud self-reliance, gritty toughness, and fierce independence. That is what made Texas, and that is what will save her again. Howdy, folks. Sam Houston here. I want to thank you for tuning into the Feed Bandit podcast. Feed Bandit is the Texas first outdoors brand built by rabid Texans, for rabid Texans, and all those who aim to be one someday. We unapologetically promote the ideals that shape our Texas pride and Texas first patriotism through our love of hunting, the outdoors, and the gear and apparel we create. Texas, above all else, preserve the tradition, protect the legacy. Check us out at feedbandit.com. And to repeat that great rallying cry from a former colleague of mine, liberty or death. Now, enough of my talking. Here are a couple of bandits that love Texas as much as I do. Enjoy.
Howdy, friend. Welcome back to the Feed Bandit podcast. Jimmy back with you. And on this one, we're going to continue our series on Leave the Swamp. And we've been talking about, the issue about whether or not Texas ought to start considering becoming independent, make Texas a country again, and all that type of stuff. And part of the way we've been doing that is reviewing the book called TEXIT by Daniel Miller. He is the president of the Texas Nationalist Movement, and he's laid out here in this book a pretty good outline. Well, number one, reasons why we should seriously consider doing this, but also how we go about getting to that point. And how we go about getting to that point is where we are in the book right now in the Becoming Independent section, or chapter, I should say. And what we're going to do on this one is just continue going down, knocking out the checklist of the things that Texas needs to take care of, or how it will handle certain things once it is independent, or what it should do ahead of time to become, to get prepared for becoming a republic again. Which, of course, us at the Feed Bandit podcast or are very extreme supporters of, I guess you could say. And I hope you're coming around to that viewpoint as well. As the quote goes from Sam Adams, he says, let me get it exactly right. Okay. It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. Well, that's what we're trying to do here with the Feed Bandit podcast in this series, Leave the Swamp. So let's continue, and we'll continue by talking about currency and banking. This is particularly an interest of mine. I'm actually going to be reading this with you, so I don't know exactly what he's going to say, but I will say, and I have talked about here on the podcast, the importance of going back, for any kind of, if you want to have freedom, you have to have sound money that cannot be printed out of thin air, created by government at will, that money that could be essentially stolen from you through inflation. That's exactly what we have in the United States right now, and really every country pretty much around the world has that. However, sound currency, such as gold and things, are coming to the forefront now more than ever. And I did a podcast on Texas, how it passed a gold bill. Go back and look at that one. Let's see. That one was back, where is that? July 17th. So that was a good podcast to listen to. But let's go through this chapter and see what he has to say. And apologies ahead of time. The allergies are wreaking havoc on me right now, so if I'm sniffling or whatever, just bear with me, please. Thank you. All right. Currency and banking. One major benefit of TEXIT is, for the first time, Texas will have the opportunity for full control over our currency and monetary policy. The best part is we can regain as much control over it as we want at a pace that makes sense for us. There is, however, one important consideration. Minimizing disruption during the transition out of the Union may initially dictate one course of action, while long-term financial stability for the new nation-state will likely require something different. As a state, Texas has absolutely no control over monetary policy. While the United States Congress ostensibly has control over fiscal policy, monetary policy is solely determined by the pseudo-governmental Federal Reserve, which I might add is unconstitutional if you read the actual Constitution. It does not prevent states from having control over money. It just says states must coin gold and silver and make that money. And it really doesn't give the federal government power over it of the money. And so everything is a back-ass word here, if you will. Without consent or true oversight by elected representatives, they control the supply of currency, the flow of capital, and set the interest rates. In short, even though our participation in the governmental process of the Union, we have virtually no say in monetary policy. TEXIT changes all that. Where Texas decides to go depends on the degree of control we want over monetary policy. For this, we need to look at how other self-governing nations deal with the issue of currency. And I might just add here, and he may get into this, but there is a difference between money and currency. Currency are those pieces of paper or digits that you send back and forth to buy and sell things. Money is essentially the thing that backs up that currency, the thing that's there to maintain the purchasing power of that currency over time. When a nation-state first gains independence, in the absence of its own currency, it usually declares unilaterally the currency that is common to the region as its official currency. That is called an informal currency union. In the early days of independence, doing so provides for economic stability, as consumers and businesses can continue to transact business in exactly the same way as they always have. Where the U.S. dollar is concerned, its status as an international reserve currency has made it attractive to countries that have no desire to adopt their own currency. Many self-governing countries even allow the U.S. dollar to circulate freely in addition to their own currency. According to a 2014 article on the website called Quartz, quote, the U.S. dollar is the most widely used currency in the world, with many countries employing it as an accepted alternative to their own currency. But some have simply adopted the currency as their own, notes and all, in what is known as dollarization. They don't have control over the currency. Only the Federal Reserve in Washington sets monetary policy. End quote. To be clear, this can be done without the blessing of the United States, as it has been in Ecuador, East Timor, El Salvador, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau, Turks and Caicos, British Virgin Islands, and Zimbabwe. If Texas wanted to have a say in monetary policy and still use the U.S. dollar, it would have to negotiate a formal currency union with the United States. Formal currency unions are common in the world. In fact, there are more than 20 official currency unions throughout the world. While a negotiated currency union with the United States would be desirable, the terms under which such an agreement would be executed likely would not give Texans any more control over monetary policy than we have now. The most likely scenario is that Texas will adopt the U.S. dollar as its official currency in the immediate aftermath of a TEXIT vote to encourage stability while seeking a negotiated currency union with the United States. Depending on the terms of any negotiated agreement or in the absence of one, Texas will want to explore moving forward a currency of its own as soon as possible. Given the lack of long-term financial stability in the United States due to the exploding national debt, almost $40 trillion now, absolutely ridiculous. That alone will be the albatross that'll bring down everything and Texas with it if we don't do something about it. A Texas currency should come sooner rather than later. Closely attached to the issue of currency is that of banking. Banking institutions are already covered by a regulatory regime that makes for a smooth transition during TEXIT. Existing federal law already allows foreign banks to operate in the United States through a direct banking office or a non-banking representative office. Foreign banks also run standard consumer retail banks with their deposits insured by the FDIC, just like domestic banks. In fact, many large U.S. banks are owned by foreign banks. In 2015, Bauer Financial, a Florida-based research firm, compiled a list of banks in the United States that are at least 25% foreign-owned and identified 44 different banking operations in the United States. This list includes the familiar full-service retail banks Compass and HSBC. Conversely, the state of Texas I think Compass was bought and rolled into something. BBVA, I think it was. Yeah, BBVA. And then maybe that was rolled into something else now. You can't keep track of all that stuff. Or it changed its name. Conversely, the state of Texas currently allows non-Texas banks to operate in Texas. In fact, Texas goes out of its way to ensure that operating a bank in Texas is as attractive as possible. Article 16, Section 16C of the Texas Constitution provides that Texas chartered state banks have the same rights and privileges that are or may be granted to national banks of the United States domiciled in Texas. This clause essentially gives banks an option to operate under a charter from the United States or from the state of Texas operating under the oversight of the Texas Department of Banking. Way back in July 1999, then Governor George W. Bush signed a bill into law that formally opened Texas to interstate bank branching. The bill made Texas bank charters one of the most attractive in the United States to conduct banking business. The bill included what was called the super parity provision, which provides a framework for a state bank chartered in Texas to conduct any of the activities allowed by any other insured state or federal institution anywhere else in the United States. This provision increases the value of existing state charters and increases Texas' appeal as a central location from which to conduct nationwide banking activities. In contrast, there is no super parity provision available to so-called national banks. With the existing laws and regulations already in place, both in Texas and the United States, banking is likely to be one of the areas that will be least affected by TEXIT. Totally agree. That should be one of the areas that's the easiest to transition during a TEXIT, no question about it. And now, since this book was written 7-8 years ago, now with Texas this year passing the Gold Currency Act, now we have the actual monetary backing that could be put in place prior to TEXIT. That then, when Texas wanted to maybe issue its own currency, they could back it by the gold and let that compete against the U.S. dollar. And I think what you'd see is the value of the Texas currency would be the Texas currency, the Texas dollar, whatever you want to call it. The TXD would be what people hold and save because and they spend the U.S. dollar because the U.S. dollar would be continually and will continue to lose its value, purchasing power against gold over time. So the Texas currency could become the strongest in the world, and that would be a huge boon to the people of Texas. We could buy whatever we needed all over the world, and our currency would just continue to grow in value and purchasing power parity over other countries, thereby helping to make Texas the most prosperous and the richest country in the world. Well on the way there. Here's another one another question that would have inevitably come up and be of interest to folks out there, especially you baby boomers and whatnot, since y'all would be the main ones who would probably be, at least right now, would be in control of whether Texas actually left or not. Maybe not in 10 or 20 years, but for now. And that is what happens to my Social Security. So he says, the Social Security issue is perhaps the thorniest and most complex. If most Texans understood how the system currently worked, they would likely opt for open rebellion rather than an orderly TEXIT. Before looking at how Texas should handle this issue in the negotiation and transition phase, it is important to make an honest assessment of the Social Security system as it is now in the United States. While Social Security retirement benefits are perceived as an earned benefit, in actuality, the benefits paid are at the discretion of the federal government. It amounts to a government-sponsored, government-mandated Ponzi scheme that relies on an increasing number of workers who pay into the system in order to pay out benefits promised by the self-serving political class. The faith in the government's ability to meet its promises is eroding daily. A recent survey by the Pew Research Center found 41% of Americans think there will be no Social Security benefits for them when they retire. Well, and that's a smart assumption. Or really the assumption is, really what they're saying is, okay, maybe you'll get a check, but again, going back to the purchasing power of the currency, that check, where maybe it could have paid your rent today, that same amount in 20 years, that might be able to just buy you a loaf of bread. Another third believe they will receive significantly reduced levels of benefit. In CNBC's article about that report, they painted an even dire scenario. The Social Security and Medical Trustees report projects that all Social Security trust funds will be depleted by 2033. Now, that's not far from now. At that point, the agency will be able to pay out about 77% of retirement benefits from payroll taxes collected. By 2088, the trustees forecast the agency will be able to pay out 72% of benefits. A study from Harvard and Dartmouth project the trust fund could be depleted sooner than that and claim Social Security Administration's actual forecasts have been consistently overstating the financial health of the program's trust funds since 2000. That is probably closer to the truth. When contemplating the path forward in negotiating this aspect of TEXIT, it's important to keep in mind that the real possibility exists that Social Security retirement will disappear sooner rather than later. It is also important to think about current and future Texans who are forced to pay into retirement system that could leave them destitute in their old age. And let me just stop here and say, of course, in a free society, we would all have the choice whether or not to pay into the system. And it would be our choice. If we chose not to, then we would do it with the full knowledge that, okay, in 40, 50 years, then if I'm not paying now, I'm not going to have it then. And that's my right. That's my freedom to make that choice. But considering we're not in a free system like that, that's why we're all forced to pay into a giant Ponzi scheme that, as we can see here, is going to go bankrupt anyway. So, what are you going to do? Let's see what he has to say about that. In a post-referendum TEXIT, Texans will need to think about Texans first and will have to advocate for them. While we can look for common ground in other areas of negotiation and seek opportunities for a win-win solution, when it comes to Social Security, Texans must take a no-surrender approach. Any Texan who is paid into the Social Security system and is currently receiving benefits should continue to receive them. This is non-negotiable. This was an obligation of the federal government to those who paid into the system and should therefore be met without question, hesitation, or reservation. This should be no problem for the federal government, so that it is possible for Social Security recipients to move to a foreign country and still collect their benefits. Additionally, those who have paid in should be able to preserve their accrued benefits for exactly the same reason. To lessen the impact of a sudden change in the system, workers who are currently paying into that system should be given an option to continue paying into the Social Security system, United States Social Security system, or opting out completely. It's safe to assume that many Texans will opt out and invest in private retirement accounts, but some will want to continue paying into the federal system, especially those close to retirement age. Given the reports of how dire the situation is for Social Security Trust Fund, the federal government will likely find it appealing to have some Texans still paying into the system. Moving forward, Texans may find it beneficial to establish a voluntary retirement and pension system similar to the one that already exists for state employees and educators. An easier step would be open enrollment for either or both of those systems to any citizen in Texas. Where the future relationship between Texas and the United States is concerned, this is more important than it might seem on its face. Post-TEXIT, there will be businesses that have feet in both Texas and the United States. Those businesses will want to seamlessly transfer workers from one place to another without potentially subjecting them to dual Social Security taxation. The situation that occurs when a worker from one country works in another country and is required to pay Social Security taxes to both countries on the same earnings. This is accomplished by the execution of what are known as international totalization agreements. Totalization agreements allow workers to combine the years they have worked in two different countries in order to be eligible for retirement benefits in one or both countries. The retirement benefits paid by each country are prorated based on the number of years worked there. Totalization agreements are not alien to the United States. They currently have such agreements with Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Chile, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Portugal, the Slovak Republic, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Woo! Okay, all in one breath. Stephen Weiser, a tax lawyer with a practice focusing on international tax matters, explained how these totalization agreements work. So, for example, if an individual accumulates 6 years of coverage under the U.S. Social Security system and 10 years of coverage in another country's system that requires 15 years of coverage for full benefit eligibility, both countries will treat the individual as if a total of 16 years had been completed under each system. However, the U.S. benefit would be 5/16 of the benefit computed on the basis of earnings in both countries during the 15-year period, and of course 10/16 in the other country. Regardless of the final shape of any agreement on Social Security, it's important to mention that if the United States fails to negotiate in good faith on this issue, or if they fail to honor their obligations to hardworking Texans who have paid into their system, Texas will always take care of its most vulnerable citizens. The total amount of federal money that comes back to Texas annually for federal pension benefits is approximately $74 billion. This is far short of the $120 to $160 billion annually that we overpay to the federal system. That will now stay here in Texas. In short, if they chose the immoral route, we've got it covered. And that's an important point there, just to remind you that the federal government steals significantly more money from Texas than it sends back to Texas. If we just stop sending money to Mordor to be, pissed away, Texas will be in great shape. No question about it. All right. Now, this next one, let's see here. All right, yeah, this next one is kind of interesting. Military and defense. The issues that will consume the majority of the negotiations between the United States and a post-TEXIT Texas are, without a doubt, the issues of the military and defense. This fact has not gone unnoticed by TEXIT skeptics who can't decide whether the military will be sent to kill everyone who voted for TEXIT or will close down all military bases in Texas, thereby wrecking the economies of the surrounding communities. While both fears are completely irrational, they subconsciously recognize how thorny this issue will be. Texas is currently home to 15 military installations with an economic impact of around $150 billion. I would argue that's way too many, by the way. However, the military installations account for only $14 billion in federal payroll spending in Texas. In addition, there are currently more than 118,000 Texans on active duty status across all branches of the military. These are not insignificant figures. However, it is important not to conflate the issues of military presence and political union. The United States maintains nearly 800 military bases in more than 70 countries and territories abroad. That is absolutely ridiculous. Any free republic should never have military bases in any countries abroad, and their military should only be here to protect the borders of this country. What that tells you is the United States is the world's empire, and empires inevitably go bankrupt. Their society collapses into immorality, and that their currency gets debased and destroyed through overspending, currency printing, government overspend, debt, all this stuff. That's the inevitable life cycle of an empire, and then it'll collapse. This brings me all back to my point here. We want to get out before that collapse drags us all down here in Texas. So, let's see. No one would argue that those 70 countries are in a political union with the United States due to the presence of a U.S. military base, nor would anyone argue that they should be. The presence of these military bases on foreign soil is solely about shared defense concerns and security interests. After a TEXIT, Texas may not share a government with the rest of the United States, but we will still share defense and national security concerns. International military cooperation has been a cornerstone of U.S. defense policy since the Second World War, and while it has been suggested that there should be some reforms, the underlying policy is unlikely to change, especially close to home. It is therefore highly probable that Texas would enter into a mutual defense pact with the United States that includes joint use and operation of existing military bases and facilities in Texas. Now, I'll have something to say about this. As a part of any mutual defense pact, Texas will likely have to pledge to spend a set percentage of its GDP on national defense, much like the reforms proposed for NATO. In return, the United States should guarantee the availability of military arms and equipment for tariff-free purchase by manufacturers in the United States and vice versa. Texas should stipulate that the Mutual Defense Pact should only extend to commonly agreed defense concerns. Any mutual defense pact of this nature could set a transition period where things essentially stay as they are now, operating under a joint command until such time as the already established Texas military forces are at full readiness. While this is fine for moving forward, there is still the issue of the now foreign Texans who are currently serving in the U.S. military. There is already federal policy in place that governs non-citizens in the military. Every year, more than 8,000 non-citizens enlist in the armed forces. In addition, because of existing international treaties, citizens of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Palau are allowed to enlist and regularly do so, as are Canadian citizens of Native American heritage. It is reasonable to assume that the United States military would want to extend this existing policy to cover the 118,000 Texans who currently serve, and likely any other Texans who would want to in the future. Okay, but we got, this would not be like a line in the sand for me if Texas were to get out, like I hope it does. But I would say it would behoove us to do it with the plan that all United States military forces would be out of Texas within a certain period of time. You simply cannot have a foreign government having military bases on your soil and still consider yourself to be a free and independent country. Further, Texas, whenever you have a standing army, it's always it's a hammer looking for a nail. And whenever that happens, there's always the tendency for politicians to want to use that standing army to intervene in things across the world, act like the savior of other countries. Basically in general, stick your nose in other people's business, which eventually comes back to bite you. So I would argue and really push for, when this gets serious, for Texas to become the Switzerland of North America. And what do I mean by that? Well, that would be Texas becoming neutral, a neutral party in the world. Like as George Washington said in his farewell address, basically saying, peace and commerce with all countries and entangling alliances with none. And that includes the United States. We should not have entangling alliances with the United States. I would argue we shouldn't even have a defense pact with the United States. If Texas focused on peace and commerce, there would be no reason for any country to attack Texas at all. Now, that's really the position the United States should have always been. It's not. For obvious reasons. I mean, or not for obvious reasons, but it's obviously not, peace and commerce. That's all it is. It's an empire with all these bases everywhere and sticking its nose in everybody's business and telling them what they should and shouldn't do. That's not what Texas should be. That's not that. But I would argue, being the Switzerland of North America and peace and commerce with all, neutrality, that will be a key pillar to getting to this most prosperous nation status in the world. Because all wars do, all standing armies and wars do, they drag you down, they bleed you dry, they create debt, and eventually they get you into stupid and idiotic wars whenever the right, quote-unquote, right politician comes into power and lies us into stupid wars like the United States is involved in right now. So, this is I can see, okay, that's all great what he's talking about, but there has to be on a timeline where things sunset and Texas becomes a neutral friend to all, but under no entangling alliances with anybody. That's key. The next section here talks about the national debt. Oh, I'm curious to see what he's going to say about this, because I have an idea here. So let's see if I agree. When it comes to the national debt, there is no softening the blow. When Texas leaves, it will have to take its share of the national debt with it. If the negotiations regarding the military win the prize for taking the most, the negotiations over the national debt will win the prize for being the most contentious. After all, in any divorce, outside of custody battles over children, money is the most heated issue. This will be no different. In a book, I guess it's called Dismantling Confederation, the divisive question of the national debt, Paul Booth looked at this issue in the event of Quebec exiting Canada. In it, he stated that division of public debt is considered one of the toughest and longest negotiated subjects during state secessions. The contention will come in calculating Texas's share of the debt. It is highly unlikely that there will be any easy agreement on the issue. For example, the United States will likely demand that we take the national debt and divide that figure by the total population of the United States to get the per person share of the debt. By multiplying, and then you multiply that by the population of Texas. So let's see. So he calculated these in 2016. Now you got to do it right now. Let's see. I can do that calculation roughly real fast, and let's just use 350 million for the country population, and let's use 35 million for Texas population, let's say. Okay, we have 40 trillion. 1 2 3 1 2 3, that's 40 million. 1 2 3, that's 40 billion. 1 2 3, that's 40 trillion, divided by 350. 1 2 3 1 2 3. Okay, so that comes to $115,000 a person. All right. Times that by 35 million. 2 3 1 2 3. Whoa. Okay, so that comes to 4.1 trillion. All right, so Texas's share per that calculation would be $4.1 trillion. So, and he says, I'm fairly certain they'll send us an invoice. Texas will likely counter that we have paid substantially more into the federal system than we have gotten out of it for decades. Using the most conservative figure of $100 billion annually in overpayment, 16 years of overpayment should pretty much wipe the slate clean. Throw that on top of the fact that while the federal government was busy exploding the national debt and spending like a drunken sailor on shore leave, Texas has been one of the prime drivers of economic growth for the entire United States. That doesn't even take into account that a large portion of the debt came from funding programs Texas didn't want or need, or was wasted by federal mismanagement and inefficiency. I would argue every dime, every penny of the debt was wasted by federal mismanagement and inefficiency. But we'll continue. It is evident just from these viewpoints that any negotiations over the national debt and Texas's liability for its share will be exceptionally heated and, unless cooler heads prevail, could have detrimental effects on both Texas and the United States. The effects were highlighted in the 1997 essay by Daniel Bloom entitled The Apportionment of Public Debt and Assets During the State Secession, published in the Case Western Reserve Journal of International Law. Bloom noted that, quote, extended bargaining over the apportionment of the public debt and assets could prove costly because cool-headed calculations may not be easily made during heated secession negotiations. A heated debate between the seceding state and the parent state over the apportionment of the public debt and assets could affect both states' international credibility rating. Additional activities hurt by a prolonged debate include future trade between the two states and the states' participation in financial markets. A quick agreement between the seceding state and the parent state on the apportionment of debt and assets is imperative to a smooth, peaceful, inexpensive transition to independence. That I agree with. Although that's end quote. Although there is no established international law that would compel Texas to pay anything, it will most likely want to. It has been customary throughout the world that when a state secedes from a larger country or confederation, it voluntarily accepts a portion of the national debt. This was the case with Singapore leaving Malaysia in 1965 and Bangladesh when it left Pakistan in 1971. Blum's additional observations on the matter point to why Texas should follow suit. Now this is getting... Let's see what this says, because it's getting into my thoughts on the matter. Economic and political realities usually compel the seceding state to voluntarily assume its share of the public debt. For instance, when Ukraine seceded from the former Soviet Union, Ukraine initially refused to pay any part of the Soviet Union's outstanding debt. However, for 4 months, no other country would loan money to Ukraine until it finally agreed to pay its share of the Soviet debt. As a result, the seceding state may desire to voluntarily assume a portion of the public debt to portray itself as a respectable borrower in international financial markets. End quote. Although the 1983 Vienna Convention on Secession of State in Respect of State Property, Archives, and Debts attempted, and that's a mouthful, attempted to establish an internationally recognized framework to deal with the issue. It only ended up establishing that a seceding state had an obligation to assume a portion of the debt in the absence of any superseding agreement between the two parties. It didn't, however, expound on how that proportion should be calculated. Blum's essay identified 4 different methods that could be used for calculation. The first is the per capita approach previously explored. The second is the GDP approach, which takes the state percentage of the overall GDP with that percentage used as the percentage of national debt that's assumed. Yeah, I don't like that. Let's see, for Texas, that'd be somewhere between 9 and 10% on average, amounting to approximately, well, that'd amount to about $4 trillion. That's what I've said right now. That'd be about the same thing. Now, I don't really like that because GDP is a BS calculation in the first place. And the reason why is because it factors in government spending, and government spending in and of itself is a negative on the economy. It's a drag on the economy, not a plus. Anyway, I digress. So, the third approach, which was explored earlier, is called the historical benefits approach, where the amount of money paid into the federal system by the state is compared with the amount of money that has been paid by the federal system into the state. This ratio is applied as a percentage to the national debt and is the amount owed. In the case of Texas, our portion of the national debt would be 0. All right, so if I went into negotiations, that would be my initial stand, of course. Blum refers to the final method as the historical tax shares approach, which he explains in his essay. It says, quote, "The rationale for the historical tax shares approach is that the seceding state must assume full responsibility for obligations of the federal government to its own citizens, and the seceding state's debt cannot be calculated independently of the asset side of the balance sheet. Hence, this method utilizes a balance sheet approach by matching federal assets with liabilities. All federal assets are evaluated and each asset is allocated to a portion of the debt incurred. As a result, a link is formed between the assets and the debt, requiring the repayment of the debt to be the same percentage as the amount of the assets received. The seceding state should assume $1 of debt for every $1 of assets that the seceding state takes. If the amount of assets apportioned to the seceding state is greater or less than the amount of debt apportioned to the seceding state, the amount of debt actually assumed by the seceding state is raised or lowered to equalize the seceding state's share of the public debt and assets." End quote. This method is the most difficult to calculate for both parties and impossible to calculate with any certainty, given the lack of financial accountability on the part of the federal government. The simple fact is there's no easy way to predict how negotiations over the national debt will play out or if there can ever be a consensus over the issue. What is known is that until there's a TEXIT, Texas' share of the national debt will continue to climb. Yep, that's why when this book was written, it was like 2.2 trillion, 2.1 trillion, and now, based on my calculation, it's 4.1 trillion. And that's only in 10 years, so it's doubled $2 trillion. Added $2 trillion in 10 years. What's it going to, since this book was written? Or less than 10 years, really. 7 years or so when it was written. What's it going to be in 5 years now? It's going to be another $5 trillion on top of that, probably. Just the pace that the government is spinning us into the poorhouse. For Texas to be successful on the other side of the issue, it must negotiate in good faith and must signal its willingness to pay its fair share of the national debt, even if that share is $0. Yeah, so, for what should happen is that should be Texas's opening offer, is to say, look, we've overpaid every year for God knows how long. So we've more than enough paid for any kind of quote unquote portion of national debt, which is accumulation of spending deficits that the federal government does. That is the fair outcome. Federal government won't go for that, I'm sure. So then it should be anywhere between that and the population apportionment calculation, which is, as of right now, was 4.1 trillion. Okay, great. Texas takes on the $4.1 trillion in U.S. dollar debt. And in the meantime, leading up to this, Texas will have been accumulating gold reserves, slowly but surely. And when the time happens and, Texas is fairly settled after secession and things are up and running, I mean, not that they would be down, but I mean, people are used to the way it is and everything. One day the governor wakes up, or the president of Texas, I should say, probably, and he signs an executive order, or the Congress of Texas passes a law that says Texas no longer has an obligation to pay this debt, and we are defaulting. You will not get paid, or something in between could be like, all right, this debt will be paid, but contingent upon X percent of taxes collected from our oil and gas or something, So people may need to take a haircut, whatever it is, something that'll be easy for Texas to pay that won't bring us down. Either way, Texas should just basically default, in my opinion, and move on. And remember, the argument here against a country doing that is because other countries won't lend it money, meaning buy its bonds, because they'll be afraid that they'll default. Well, I would argue Texas has a pretty good case to make, saying, look, while we were part of the United States, we sent more money than came back here. Okay? If we want to borrow money, there will be people that will lend us money, knowing that all that money that we sent to the United States back in the day is staying here in Texas to pay whatever debt we want to raise. So we're going to get rid of this BS debt that the U.S. federal government saddled us with. We're going to start over a clean slate here and move forward. And then I would also argue one step further that the very fact that Texas sent the U.S. government more money than came back here tells you that Texas does not need to borrow money in the first place. So let that one kind of marinate in your mind, noodle in your head. The examples they gave were of countries that either had no natural resources or anything to speak of that they could lean back on, any industry that they could speak of to lean back on to trade with other countries, or they're totally utterly corrupt, like the Ukraine, things of that nature. But I mean, remember what Texas has here. I mean, the amount of money and wealth that's here in Texas, we don't need that debt. We don't need to pay that debt. It's BS debt that was created that we would be saddled with. Get rid of it. Just repudiate it, default on it, and move on. It would be perfectly fine. Last part of this chapter, called The Rest. It cannot be overemphasized that independence is a state of being to which an independent Texas will continue to aspire. It is not a rejection of interconnectedness. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that Texas can work with other self-governing nations as peers. There will certainly be other issues that arise during the transition from state to nation-state. But as we've seen, with what are usually considered the major issues, there are already laws, policies, and international norms that exist to cover every eventuality, and Texas is well suited for the challenge. While TEXIT may raise issues that seem insurmountable to some, they have been experienced and solved by people all over the world. And it's always important to remember the Texas proverb, if you want something done, tell a Texan that it can't be done. Hear, hear. All right, well that was a heck of a chapter there, and he does dispel a lot of the BS arguments, and like, well, how are we going to do that? How is this going to be handled? And we kind of move past all that. So it's quickly becoming clear to me that there really is no good argument against Texas leaving the swamp, or for seceding. There's just nothing out there that really makes me hesitate. And hopefully you listening to this, it's not making you hesitate either, or at the very least, if you hadn't thought about it, it's bringing you over to the side, and seeing why, wow, you know what, it could be done. Things could be taken back into our own hands. We could have a state where we don't have to worry about, all these other people in Mordor telling us what to do. We could all have those arguments in Austin. Well, that's the whole idea, right? So think about it, noodle on it, we as Texans should be in total control of our future, and no one else should be. That's the bottom line. All right, well, I want to thank you very much for listening to this one. It went a little longer than normal, and thank you for considering what I have to say about this matter and what we at Feed Bandit have to say about this matter. As I'm recording this, we're in dove season, so I'm hoping some of you or all of you have gotten out and gotten you some birds, and all the good stuff. Getting closer to deer season, getting fired up for that. So with that, I'm going to leave you, and once again, just thank you for listening. Stay tuned for another episode coming around shortly. Remember, we have our daily Texas history roundups, so I hope you're enjoying those. And head on over to feedbandit.com and check out the new gear we have. We got some really cool Texas and hunting camp polos out there. I really believe they're unique and really cool prints. Same with the hats, really cool stuff that you can get. So head on over there and check them out, please. That whatever you can do will really help us out and support this cause that we have here at the Feed Bandit. With that, I will leave you, and remember just to say, support your local feed store. All right, you take care.
Well, I hope the Bandits gave you an interesting episode that either entertained or educated you. Or better yet, both. Hell, I told them this podcasting thing looks harder to do than defeating Santa Anna. So if you would, please help them out by sharing it with all your like-minded friends to help the Bandits get the word out. And don't forget to check us out at feedbandit.com and grab some gear and apparel to support the cause of Texas. Remember, Texas, above all else, preserve the tradition, protect the legacy. Finally, as I said some time ago on the eve of the great battle, and I vigorously repeat here again, be men, be free men, that your children may bless their father's name. Well, fellow bandit, until next time.